What happens when an undercover CEO steps into his own food factory and uncovers a nightmare? Jonathan Westwood thought his company, Westwood Foods, was thriving until reports of worker mistreatment, safety violations, and declining quality reached his desk. To get the truth, he went undercover as a factory worker. What he discovered was shocking. Exhausted employees, unreported injuries, expired ingredients, and a management team covering it all up. But Jonathan wasn't about to let his company rot from the inside. Watch as he exposes corruption, confronts the people responsible, and fights to rebuild the business the right way. This is a story you won't forget. Jonathan Price had built Westwood Foods from the ground up, turning it into one of the most respected food processing companies in the industry. The company had gained its reputation for high-quality products, ethical sourcing, and fair treatment of workers. It wasn't just about profits, it was about integrity. That's why Jonathan took pride in his business, believing that Westwood wasn't just another food manufacturer, but a company people could trust. However, in the past year, trouble had been brewing. Reports of customer complaints had been piling up, claims of food quality issues, mislabeled expiration dates, and a decline in freshness. At the same time, employee turnover had skyrocketed, with workers leaving at alarming rates. Even longtime employees who had been loyal to the company for years were suddenly quitting without warning. Something wasn't right. Jonathan brought up these concerns with his executive team, but their responses were dismissive. They assured him that it was just temporary staffing shortages, a common issue in large-scale food production. The board of directors, more focused on financial reports than employee well-being, insisted that recent cost-cutting measures were necessary for keeping the company profitable. Nothing to worry about, they said. But Jonathan wasn't convinced. He had built this company by trusting his instincts, and his instincts told him something was deeply wrong. Then came the breaking point. A loyal supermarket chain, one of Westwood's biggest buyers, threatened to drop their contract after repeated issues with tainted products. At the same time, a former employee anonymously leaked concerns about poor working conditions and food safety violations. The cracks in Westwood's foundation were widening, and if Jonathan didn't act fast, everything he had worked for could come crashing down. There was only one way to get to the truth. He would have to see it for himself, not as the CEO, but as a worker on the factory floor. Jonathan made a bold decision. He would go undercover inside one of his own food processing plants. Only then would he uncover what was really happening behind the scenes. Dressed in a worn-out uniform and steel-toe boots, Jonathan Price walked into the Westwood Foods processing plant as just another factory worker. His name badge read John Pierce, and no one had any idea that the man standing beside them, waiting for his shift to start, was actually the CEO of the company. He had taken all the necessary steps to keep his identity a secret. A fake work history, a hastily arranged background check, and a placement through a third-party hiring agency. If his executives wouldn't tell him the truth, he would find it himself. The moment he stepped onto the factory floor, reality hit him harder than he expected. The air was thick with the scent of raw ingredients and industrial chemicals, the sound of whirring machines filling every corner of the plant. Workers moved like clockwork, their faces tense with concentration as they handled conveyor belts, packed products, and monitored quality control. But there was something off, something unsettling. Jonathan had expected hard work, but what he saw was relentless exhaustion. Employees were being pushed to the brink, moving at breakneck speed with no breaks in sight. In just the first hour, he watched as a worker in her late 50s struggled to keep up with a conveyor belt that moved too fast, her hands trembling as she tried to seal a package correctly. No one helped her. A supervisor stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes scanning for mistakes rather than offering assistance. Then there was the temperature. The room where perishable goods were stored was frigid, yet workers were forced to move in and out of it constantly without proper gear. In another section, where ingredients were processed, the heat was unbearable. Sweat dripped down workers' faces, but no one dared to slow down. Breaks were a luxury. Workers whispered about clocking out off the books just to grab water or use the restroom. One worker confided in him during a brief pause near the loading dock, "You don't stop or they cut your hours. And if you complain, good luck keeping your job." Jonathan's stomach twisted. This wasn't the company he had built. This wasn't Westwood Foods. This was something else. Something ruthless. And he was just getting started. As Jonathan continued his shift on the factory floor, the dangers of the job became painfully clear. Machines hummed and roared at an unrelenting pace. Conveyor belts moved swiftly, and workers operated heavy-duty equipment with little room for error. One misstep could lead to disaster, yet safety seemed like an afterthought. Within his first few hours, Jonathan witnessed a young worker, barely in his 20s, nearly lose a hand when a packaging machine malfunctioned. The worker managed to yank his hand away just in time, but instead of stopping production, the supervisor merely scowled and barked, "Keep working. If you slow down, we fall behind." The worker grimaced, shaking his wrist, but nodded and continued, his face pale. Jonathan's stomach churned. No accident report, no first aid, just back to work as if nothing happened. And that wasn't the only close call. Later in the shift, an older worker, probably in his 60s, slipped on a puddle of oil near the loading dock. He fell hard, his knee hitting the concrete with a sickening crack. A few workers rushed to help him, but before they could, a floor manager hurried over. "Get up," she hissed in a low voice, "and don't make a scene. If they think you can't handle the job, you're out." The injured worker groaned, gritted his teeth, and forced himself back onto his feet, limping as he returned to his station. Jonathan clenched his fists. How many injuries had gone unreported because workers feared losing their jobs? During his short breaks, Jonathan quietly listened to his co-workers, hoping to understand how deep the problem ran. What he learned was worse than he imagined. Many injuries never made it to HR. Workers were either pressured to stay silent or were given vague warnings about not causing trouble. Some were even expected to pay for their own medical care after getting hurt on the job, since official injury reports were rarely filed. One worker muttered to him, "We all got hurt at some point. You either deal with it or they replace you." Jonathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold storage room. Westwood Foods had become a place where safety was sacrificed for efficiency, where people were disposable, and he wasn't going to let it continue. As Jonathan continued his undercover shift, he realized that the factory's problems didn't stop at worker exploitation. The conditions of the food production process were just as alarming. He'd always believed that Westwood Foods prided itself on quality and safety, but what he witnessed behind the scenes painted a much darker picture. It started with the meat storage area. Jonathan was assigned to the packaging line, where large trays of pre-cooked frozen meals were assembled. When he opened a storage fridge to retrieve ingredients, a foul stench hit him immediately. Inside, several boxes of chicken were stacked haphazardly, some clearly past their expiration date. The cooling system was barely functioning, with condensation pooling under the crates. Instead of discarding the questionable meat, a supervisor simply shrugged. "Just use the ones that don't smell too bad," he muttered before walking away. Jonathan was horrified. This wasn't just about cutting costs, this was a blatant risk to public health. The factory workers knew it too. As he quietly asked around, he learned that expired ingredients were regularly mixed into fresh batches to avoid waste. When a worker hesitated to use spoiled dairy in a batch of creamy pasta dishes, the floor manager snapped, "If you don't do it, someone else will. We're not throwing out thousands of dollars just because you're scared of a little stomach ache." It wasn't just expired ingredients that were a problem. The production lines were full of shortcuts that compromised food safety. Conveyor belts covered in grease and food residue from previous shifts were rarely sanitized properly. Insects hovered around the sugar bins in the bakery section, yet no one addressed it. When a worker accidentally dropped a batch of raw vegetables onto the grimy floor, they were scooped up, brushed off, and dumped right back into the prep line. Jonathan watched all of this unfold in disbelief. The company's branding promised farm-fresh ingredients and rigorous quality checks, yet here he was, standing in a facility where food safety laws were ignored daily. And the worst part? No one dared to speak up. "Don't ask questions," an older worker whispered to him. "Just do your shift and go home. The ones who complain don't last long." Jonathan had seen enough. Westwood Foods wasn't just mistreating its employees, it was endangering the very customers who trusted its name, and now it was his responsibility to make sure the truth came out. Jonathan had already seen the unsafe conditions and food safety violations, but what disturbed him the most was how the workers were treated. The factory floor ran on a relentless schedule, pushing employees to their physical and mental limits. Many of them were immigrants, single parents, or people with no other job options, trapped in a system that took advantage of their desperation. His co-worker Rosa, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, had been working at Westwood Foods for nearly a decade. She confided in Jonathan during a brief water break. "They cut our hours, but expect us to do double the work," she said, massaging her swollen wrists. "If we complain, they threaten to fire us or replace us with someone younger." Rosa wasn't the only one suffering. Jonathan noticed a young man, Leo, struggling to keep up with the assembly line. He winced as he moved, his wrist wrapped in a makeshift bandage. "Sprained it last week," Leo muttered. "Manager said if I took time off, I might as well not come back." The workers were also severely underpaid. Despite grueling 12-hour shifts, many barely earned enough to cover rent. Overtime pay was a myth. Workers were clocked out on paper while still on the floor. When Jonathan questioned why no one reported it, a veteran worker scoffed, "Who would listen? They know we need these jobs. They count on us being too scared to fight back." Adding to the exploitation was a culture of fear and silence. Any attempt to stand up to management resulted in retaliation. Workers who spoke out mysteriously saw their shifts cut or were transferred to more dangerous roles. HR was no help, complaints disappeared, and whistleblowers were quickly replaced. The company had perfected a cycle of quiet abuse, ensuring that no one dared to challenge the system. As Jonathan looked around at the exhausted faces of his co-workers, he realized this wasn't just about a bad company. This was systemic exploitation. Westwood Foods had built its empire on the backs of these workers, squeezing them dry while treating them as disposable. And unless something changed, the cycle would never end. Jonathan knew that exposing Westwood Foods wouldn't be easy. The company had spent years covering its tracks, ensuring that any complaints were buried, workers were silenced, and inspectors saw only what they were meant to see. If he wanted to bring real change, he needed undeniable proof, something so irrefutable that neither management nor the corporate board could ignore it. Over the next week, he carefully documented everything. He used a hidden voice recorder to capture supervisors threatening workers with pay cuts and termination if they refused to work through injuries. He discreetly took photos of spoiled meat being repackaged, moldy ingredients hidden beneath fresh layers, and rodents scurrying through storage areas. Even more damning, he managed to access shift records that proved workers were being clocked out early while still being forced to work. But he needed one final piece: direct involvement from upper management. That's when he set his trap. Posing as an eager, obedient worker, Jonathan asked his supervisor a seemingly harmless question: "What should I do if I see something bad happen with the food?" The answer was exactly what he expected. "Keep your mouth shut and keep working," the supervisor snapped, "unless you want to lose your job." Jonathan pushed further, asking about the unpaid overtime and why workers were being denied breaks. His supervisor smirked. "That's just how things work around here. You either keep up or find another job." That was it, verbal confirmation of what everyone already knew. With all the evidence in hand, Jonathan now had enough to go public. But before he exposed everything, he had one last move to make: confront the corporate executives and give them a chance to do the right thing. If they refused, then he would take his proof straight to the authorities, the media, and the public. It was time to force Westwood Foods to answer for what they had done. Jonathan sat at the long, polished table in the Westwood Foods executive boardroom, facing a row of corporate leaders who had no idea what was coming. Across from him sat Douglas Vance, the company's CEO, along with several senior executives, all of whom had dismissed his earlier concerns as overblown rumors. They expected a routine meeting about productivity reports. Instead, Jonathan was about to expose a scandal that could shake the company to its core. He started calmly, sliding a thick folder onto the table. "Before we discuss operations, there's something you all need to see." He tapped play on a hidden recorder, and a supervisor's voice filled the room. "Keep your mouth shut and keep working, unless you want to lose your job." The air in the boardroom stiffened. Jonathan watched as the color drained from Vance's face. He didn't stop there. One by one, he laid out his findings. Photos of spoiled meat repackaged for sale, videos of workers bleeding on the production line, documents proving wage theft and unpaid overtime. He detailed how management had silenced complaints and ignored safety regulations, all in the name of profit. "This isn't just unethical," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "It's criminal. I've documented clear violations of labor laws, food safety standards, and worker protections. And if this isn't addressed immediately, this evidence will go public to the authorities, the press, and our customers." A tense silence followed. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, others exchanged worried glances. Finally, Vance spoke, his voice tight. "Jonathan, let's not act rashly. We can find a way to handle this internally." Jonathan shook his head. "No more cover-ups. Either we fix this now or I take it to the people who will." The room was on edge. The executives had a choice: own up and clean house, or let the company burn in scandal. The fallout from the boardroom confrontation was immediate. Several senior managers, including the factory supervisor and Douglas Vance himself, were forced to resign after an internal investigation confirmed their roles in the widespread exploitation and cover-ups. Regulatory agencies were brought in, and Westwood Foods had no choice but to undergo a full compliance overhaul. But for Jonathan, exposing the corruption was only the first step. True change meant rebuilding the company from the ground up. The first major reform? Worker protections. Jonathan mandated improved safety measures, including upgraded equipment, mandatory safety training, and an independent oversight committee that reported directly to the board. The punishing work quotas were abolished, ensuring employees could do their jobs without risking injury. Next came fair pay and better working conditions. Every employee received back pay for stolen wages, and the company introduced transparent wage policies to ensure fair compensation moving forward. For the first time in years, factory workers weren't afraid of losing their jobs for speaking up. Finally, food safety was prioritized. Jonathan worked closely with new quality control officers to establish strict guidelines, ensuring that no expired or contaminated products ever reached store shelves. Inspections were now routine, and employees were encouraged to report violations without fear of retaliation. Change wasn't easy, and resistance from the old guard remained, but as weeks turned into months, the factory atmosphere shifted. Workers felt heard, customers regained trust, and Westwood Foods began to rebuild its reputation, not as a company driven by greed, but as one committed to ethics, safety, and fairness. Jonathan had set out to fix what was broken, and for the first time in years, the company was on the right path. 6 months after the factory scandal rocked Westwood Foods, the company had undergone a dramatic transformation. What was once a toxic environment of exploitation and negligence had turned into a model of ethical business practices. Workers now had a voice, safety protocols were strictly enforced, and customer trust was slowly being rebuilt. For the first time in years, the factory floor no longer echoed with fear and exhaustion. Employees worked reasonable hours with fair pay, and safety violations had dropped to nearly zero. The new management team, carefully selected by Jonathan, prioritized integrity over profit shortcuts. They held weekly meetings with workers, encouraging open dialogue and ensuring concerns were addressed before they became problems. Externally, Westwood Foods launched a public transparency campaign, openly admitting past failures and showcasing the steps taken to correct them. Customers, initially skeptical, saw real changes: cleaner facilities, higher quality products, and a commitment to food safety. The company also partnered with independent auditors and consumer advocacy groups to ensure continued accountability. While the scars of past misdeeds couldn't be erased overnight, Jonathan had turned a crumbling empire into a company that valued both its employees and its customers. Westwood Foods was no longer just about profit, it was about doing the right thing. And under Jonathan's leadership, it was clear: this was just the beginning of a better future. The transformation of Westwood Foods teaches a powerful lesson about leadership, accountability, and ethical business practices. At its core, this story highlights how neglecting worker safety, cutting corners, and prioritizing profits over people can lead a company down a destructive path. It wasn't until CEO Jonathan Westwood stepped into his own factory that he realized the true cost of corporate greed: overworked employees, dangerous working conditions, and severe food safety violations. One of the most significant takeaways is that a company's success isn't just measured by its financial growth, but by the well-being of its workers and the trust of its customers. When employees are treated fairly, when their safety is prioritized, and when customers are given quality products, a business doesn't just survive, it thrives. Additionally, the story proves that change is possible, but it requires bold action from leadership. Jonathan didn't just expose corruption, he took responsibility and led the charge for reform. His commitment to transparency, ethical labor practices, and food safety restored Westwood Foods' reputation and ensured a better future for its workers. Ultimately, this story is a reminder that integrity in business isn't just the right thing to do, it's the only way to build lasting success.